Hidden deep within the archives of a small historical society in rural Louisiana lies a leather-bound journal that nearly no one has ever seen. Its pages are brittle with age, the ink faded to a rusty brown, yet the words within reveal something that was never meant to be recorded. For nearly 4 decades, from 1826 to 1867, someone meticulously documented the fates of enslaved families torn from Ridgefield Plantation, not just their names or the prices for which they were sold, but where they were sent, what became of them, and ultimately, how they died. The entries are inconsistent, appearing and disappearing without explanation. Some years list dozens of names, while others are blank. Historians who have glimpsed the journal note that the handwriting changes at least 3 times, as if multiple people or a single person over time risked everything to keep this record. The diary shouldn't exist. During the antebellum period, enslaved people were forbidden to read and write. They were denied the tools to keep records, and certainly discouraged or punished for documenting the systematic destruction of their families across state lines. And yet, somehow, this diary survived. Its very existence raises unsettling questions. Who wrote it? How did they gather such precise information? And why would anyone risk everything to chronicle what everyone else worked so hard to erase? Before we dive deeper into the secrets held within this mysterious journal, if you're fascinated by untold historical mysteries, subscribe to Liturgy of Fear, hit the notification bell, and tell us in the comments which state you're listening from. We love knowing where our community is discovering these forgotten stories. What makes this diary so chilling isn't just the information it contains, it's the effort taken to preserve the lives and fates of people who were supposed to be erased from memory. And the answer to why someone did this is darker and more complex than anyone expected. It begins on a sweltering morning in June 1826. When 7 people were sold away from the only home they had ever known. Ridgefield Plantation lay about 12 miles northwest of Nacogdoches, Louisiana, surrounded by moss-draped oaks and red clay roads that turned to sticky mud each spring. Unlike the massive sugar estates of southern Louisiana, Ridgefield was a mid-sized cotton plantation of roughly 400 acres. It produced cotton, some corn for local use, and kept a herd of half-wild, notoriously ill-tempered pigs that roamed freely in the back sections of the property, foraging along the forest that bordered the eastern edge. The land itself was unforgiving, and the lives recorded in the journal were far harsher. The soil was decent for cotton, but required constant work: clearing, plowing, planting, weeding, picking. The summers were brutal, with temperatures regularly climbing above 95 degrees and humidity that made the air feel solid. The winters were milder but unpredictable, with occasional freezes that could destroy an entire crop if they came too early or too late. By 1826, when the diary's first entry appears, the plantation had been in the Grantham family for 2 generations. The original Grantham, a man named Robert, who'd come from Virginia in the 1780s, had carved the plantation out of wilderness with a combination of borrowed money, ruthless ambition, and the labor of people he'd brought with him in chains. Robert died in 1818, leaving the property to his son James. James Grantham, who inherited the property at age 34, was known in Nichito's parish as a meticulous man. He kept detailed ledgers of every seed planted, every bale sold, every dollar spent. His account books, which still survive in the Historical Society's archives, are extraordinary in their precision. He noted the weather each day, the condition of the soil, the health of his livestock, the prices he paid for supplies. He recorded everything except notably the lives of the people he enslaved. But he wasn't known as a particularly cruel master by the standards of the time. A low bar certainly, but one that mattered in the social hierarchy of the parish. He attended St. Augustine's Episcopal Church in Nichito every Sunday when the roads were passable. He paid his debts on time. Usually, he rarely appeared in court records, which meant he didn't get into public disputes with neighbors or beat his enslaved people so badly that the authorities felt compelled to intervene. something that did happen occasionally, even in Louisiana. James had married a woman named Catherine Dubose in 1820. She came from a prominent family near Alexandria and brought a small dowry that helped stabilize the plantation's finances. They had 3 children by 1826, William, born in 1821, who would eventually inherit the plantation; Margaret, born in 1823, and an infant daughter named Elizabeth. Catherine ran the household with the same meticulous attention to detail her husband applied to the fields. She supervised the house servants, managed the kitchen, organized the social calendar, and maintained the family's reputation in the parish. The main house at Ridgefield was a 2-story structure built in the Greek Revival style that was becoming fashionable in the South. It had white columns on the front portico, wide galleries on both floors, and tall windows designed to catch whatever breeze might stir the humid air. Inside, the rooms were furnished modestly by plantation standards, good furniture, but not ostentatious. A piano in the parlor that Catherine played occasionally, a small library with perhaps 40 books. The house had been expanded twice, once by Robert Grantham and once by James, and the addition showed in the slight misalignment of the floorboards and the way the newer sections creaked differently when you walked through them. Behind the main house, about 100 yards away, stood a row of log cabins where the enslaved community lived. There were 8 cabins total, each about 12 feet by 14 feet, with a single room, a dirt floor, and a fireplace that smoked badly when the wind came from the west. Each cabin housed a family, sometimes 2 families if the quarters were crowded. The roofs were made of hand-split cypress shingles that leaked during heavy rains. There were no windows, just wooden shutters that could be closed against the cold. The doors had no locks because enslaved people weren't supposed to have privacy. The enslaved community at Ridgefield numbered around 36 people in 1826. Most of them had been born on the property or purchased from neighboring estates as children. They ranged in age from infants to an elderly woman named Aunt Bess, who was believed to be in her 70s and who'd been at Ridgefield since the plantation's founding. The community was tightly knit, bound together by kinship, shared suffering, and the knowledge that they were all subject to the same arbitrary power. Families at Ridgefield had been relatively stable, at least compared to other plantations. Children grew up knowing their parents. Siblings stayed together. Marriages, though not legally recognized, were generally respected by James Grantham, who understood that stable families meant more productive workers, and fewer attempts at escape. That stability, fragile as it was, defined life at Ridgefield. People knew each other's histories, their relatives, their griefs. The cabins might have been small and uncomfortable, but they were home. The work rhythm at Ridgefield followed the cotton season. Spring meant preparing the fields, repairing tools, planting. Summer meant endless weeding, thinning plants, battling insects. Fall meant picking from dawn until it was too dark to see the bolls. Winter meant ginning the cotton, baling it for transport, making repairs, cutting firewood, and preparing for the next cycle. The overseer, a man named Silas Talbot, enforced the work schedule with threats and occasional violence. Talbot was in his mid-40s, a wiry man with a face weathered by sun and meanness. He'd worked at Ridgefield since 1822, hired by James Grantham after the previous overseer died of yellow fever. Talbot lived in a small house between the main house and the cabins, positioned so he could watch both. He carried a whip and used it when he felt it necessary, which was often enough that everyone understood the threat was real. But despite Talbot's presence, despite the inherent violence of the system, the enslaved community at Ridgefield had managed to create something resembling a life. They had their own social structures, their own leaders, their own ways of supporting each other. Aunt Bess served as a midwife and healer, treating illnesses with herbs and knowledge passed down through generations. An older man named Elias, who worked in the stables, was respected for his wisdom and his ability to settle disputes. A woman named Rose, who worked in the main house, was known for her singing voice, and would lead hymns on Sunday evenings. When the work was done, the rations at Ridgefield were typical for the region: cornmeal, salt, pork, molasses, and whatever vegetables people could grow in small garden plots behind their cabins. It was never quite enough. Hunger was a constant presence, especially in the winter when the garden plots were bare. People supplemented their rations by fishing in the creek that ran through the property, by setting snares for rabbits and sums, by foraging for nuts and berries in the forest. The children were always thin. Punishments at Ridgefield varied depending on the perceived offense. Talking back to Tolbot might earn a slap or a few lashes. Running away or trying to meant a severe whipping and sometimes being sold. Stealing food could result in anything from extra work to physical punishment. The punishments were arbitrary, unpredictable, designed to keep people off balance and afraid. But through all of this, families stayed together. That was the unspoken agreement. Work hard, don't cause trouble, and your children would sleep in the same cabin with you. Your husband or wife would be there when you came in from the fields. Your parents would grow old in the same place where you'd been born. It wasn't freedom, but it was something. A small, fragile something that people clung to because it was all they had. Then in March of 1826, James Grantham's finances began to collapse, and that fragile stability shattered like glass. The trouble started with cotton prices. In 1825, cotton had sold for 14 cents a pound at the New Orleans market. By early 1826, the price had dropped to 9 cents, and it kept falling. James Grantham had borrowed money to expand his operations in 1824, anticipating continued high prices. He'd purchased new land, new equipment, and 4 additional enslaved people from an estate sale near Shreveport. When the cotton market collapsed, he found himself overextended and unable to meet his debt payments. Making matters worse, Grantham had invested $2,000 in a cotton mill near Alexandria, a joint venture with several other planters who'd believed they could profit by processing cotton locally rather than shipping it raw to New Orleans. The mill had opened in 1824 with great fanfare. By 1826, it was bankrupt. Poor management, insufficient capital, and competition from larger mills had killed it. Grantham lost his entire investment. By late spring 1826, James Grantham owed money to the Bank of New Orleans, to several local merchants and to a cotton factor in Nushio, who'd advanced him credit against his expected harvest. The total debt was somewhere around $6,000. Not an enormous sum by plantation standards, but enough to put Ridgefield in serious jeopardy. Grantham's creditors were starting to make noise. Letters arrived weekly demanding payment. There was talk of lawsuits, of foreclosure. Catherine Grantham pleaded with her husband to sell land. Better to operate a smaller plantation with no debt than to risk losing everything. But James was stubborn. He'd inherited 400 acres from his father, and he was determined to pass at least that much to his own son. Selling land felt like admitting defeat, like betraying his father's legacy. So, he decided to sell people instead. Word spread through the parish in May that Grantham was liquidating some of his assets. Neighbors assumed he'd sell equipment, maybe some livestock. A few anticipated he might sell 1 or 2 troublesome slaves. No one expected what actually happened. On June 6, 1826, a slave trader named Cyrus Webb arrived at Ridgefield. Webb was known throughout northern Louisiana and eastern Texas as a dealer in enslaved people. He traveled with a wagon, heavy chains, and 2 assistants who served as enforcers. Webb was in his early 50s, a heavy-set man with graying hair and cold eyes. He'd been in the trade for more than 20 years and had a reputation for efficiency and ruthlessness. He didn't haggle much. He assessed people quickly, made an offer, and moved on if the seller didn't accept. Webb arrived early in the morning before the day's work had begun. He met with James Grantham in the main house while Talbot assembled the enslaved people in the yard. Everyone knew something bad was about to happen. You didn't summon a slave trader unless you were planning to sell. The assembled community stood in the June heat, watching the main house, waiting. Children clung to their parents. Husbands stood close to wives. Aunt Bess murmured prayers. Elias, standing near the back, watched everything with his careful, observant gaze. After about an hour, Grantham and Webb emerged from the house. Webb walked slowly along the line of people, examining them the way you'd examine livestock. He checked teeth, felt muscles, asked ages. He was looking for prime workers, people in their 20s and 30s, healthy, strong. He ignored the very old and the very young, unless they came as part of a family unit. Webb made his selections quickly. He pointed to 7 people. They were not random choices. They were 3 complete families. The first family was Dinah, her husband, Thomas, and their 2 young daughters, Clara and Bess. Dinah was 28 years old, a field worker who was known for her endurance and her quiet dignity. Thomas was 32, tall and strong, one of the most productive workers on the plantation. Clara was 7, Bess was 5. The girls had been helping their mother in the garden plots, learning to cook and sew, doing the work the children did. The second family was Big Jack, his wife Mary, and their infant son, who didn't have a name yet because he was only 3 months old, and names were sometimes delayed until you knew a child would survive infancy. Big Jack was 26 years old, and lived up to his name. He was over 6 tons tall, powerfully built, capable of work that would break smaller men. Mary was 24, still recovering from childbirth, exhausted and frightened. The third was Ruth and her teenage son, Peter. Ruth was 35, a woman who'd already survived more than most. She'd been separated from her first husband years earlier, sold to Ridgefield from a plantation near Natchez. Peter was 14, on the cusp of becoming a valuable field hand. He was small for his age, but wiry and quick. When Webb pointed to these 7 people, the rest of the community understood immediately that entire families were being destroyed. This wasn't the sale of an individual troublemaker or a surplus worker. This was something different. This was arbitrary, calculated purely by market value. Dinah started to cry. She didn't make much noise. Crying loudly was dangerous, but tears ran down her face. Thomas put his arm around her and pulled the girls close. Mary clutched her baby and looked at Big Jack with an expression of pure terror. Peter grabbed his mother's hand. Ruth stood very still, her face blank, retreating into some internal place where the horror couldn't reach her. The rest of the community stood frozen. They wanted to do something, say something, but there was nothing to be done. Speaking out would only make things worse, might result in more people being sold, might get someone killed. So they stood in silence and watched as Webb approached the families he'd selected. Webb gave James Grantham his offer. He would pay $47 each for Dinah and Thomas, $22 each for the girls, $60 for Big Jack, $35 for Mary, $12 for the infant, $40 for Ruth, $35 for Peter. The total came to $335. It was insultingly low. At market rates, these 7 people were worth at least $500, probably more. But Webb knew Grantham was desperate, and desperate sellers didn't negotiate. Grantham accepted. Money changed hands. Webb's assistants brought out the chains. The children screamed when they saw the chains. Clara broke away from her mother and ran, but one of Webb's assistants caught her before she'd gotten 10 feet. He carried her back, kicking and crying, and held her while Webb shackled Dinah and Thomas together at the wrists. The girls weren't chained, but they were kept close. Big Jack was shackled at the ankles and wrists. Webb wasn't taking chances with a man that size. Mary was left unchained because she was carrying the baby, but she was positioned between the 2 assistants. Peter was shackled to his mother. The entire process took less than 30 minutes. By 9 o'clock in the morning, the 7 people were loaded into Webb's wagon. Their possessions, what few they had, were left behind. There was no time to say goodbye to anyone. No opportunity for final words. Webb wanted to move quickly. The longer you stayed, the more chances for trouble. As the wagon pulled away, the remaining enslaved community at Ridgefield stood in the yard and watched. Some people were crying openly now. Others stood in shocked silence. The children didn't understand what was happening, only that Clara and Bess were leaving, and they might never see them again. The wagon moved down the long dirt road that led away from the plantation, past the cotton fields, past the oak trees until it disappeared around a bend and was gone. And with it went Dinah, Thomas, Clara, Bess, Big Jack, Mary, their baby Ruth, and Peter. They were heading south toward Opelousas, the first stop on a journey that would scatter them across Louisiana. In the cabins that night, the community was shattered. People who'd lost family members sat in silence or wept quietly. The cabin that Dinah and Thomas had shared with their daughters was empty. The one that Big Jack, Mary, and the baby had occupied was empty. Ruth and Peter's space in a shared cabin was vacant. Those empty spaces felt like wounds, like pieces had been cut out of the community's body. Elias sat by his fire and thought about what had happened. He was 48 years old, born at Ridgefield, and he'd seen people sold before, but never entire families at once. Never arbitrary selections driven purely by financial pressure. And he understood with the cold clarity that comes from experience that this could happen again. Grantham's financial problems hadn't been solved by selling 7 people for $335. If anything, accepting such a low price suggested that the problems were worse than anyone knew. Other families could be sold. Any family. His own children were grown and working in the fields. They could be next. That night, Elias made a decision. Someone needed to know what happened to Dinah, to Thomas, to all of them. Someone needed to remember, because if no one remembered, if no one kept track, it was as if they'd never existed at all. But Elias couldn't write. He'd never been taught. Literacy was illegal for enslaved people in Louisiana, punishable by whipping or worse. But Elias knew someone who could write. There was a boy, 11 years old, who worked in the main house. His name was Benjamin. He was small for his age, quiet, observant, and Elias had noticed over the past year that Benjamin could read. He'd seen the boy looking at newspapers when he thought no one was watching. He'd seen him trace his finger across words, his lips moving silently. The next day, Elias approached Benjamin when no one else was nearby. He was direct. "You can read, can't you?" Benjamin went very still. Being caught with literacy could mean being sold or beaten. "I don't know what I'm not going to tell anyone," Elias said quietly. "But I need your help." "Can you write?" Benjamin hesitated, then nodded. "I need you to write something down for me," Elias said. "About the people who were sold. Where they went, what happened to them." Benjamin looked confused. "How would we know what happened to them?" "We'll find out," Elias said. "I'll find out. You just need to write it down." And that's how the diary began. Benjamin didn't have a journal, so he improvised. He found a partially used ledger book in James Grantham's study, one that had been abandoned after a few pages because Grantham had made an accounting error, and started fresh in a new book. Benjamin stole it. It wasn't difficult. He worked in the house, cleaned the study, and had access to things that other people didn't. He hid the ledger under his mattress in the small room behind the kitchen where he slept with 2 other house servants. The first entries were written on June 8, 1826, just 2 days after the sale. Benjamin wrote in small, careful handwriting, conscious of wasting space. Elias dictated what he knew. June 8, 1826. Dinah Thomas, 2 daughters, Clara, age 7, and Bess, age 5, sold to trader named Cyrus Webb, took them south toward Opelousas. Webb said something about rice work, but wasn't clear. $47 each for Dinah and Thomas, $22 for the children. Big Jack, wife Mary, infant son, no name, same buyer, same direction. Webb mentioned a buyer Neil Lafayette might be interested. $60 for Jack, $35 for Mary, $12 for the child. Ruth, age 35, and son Peter, age 14, purchased separate from the others. Peter sent to a brickyard in Baton Rouge, according to what Mr. Grantham said to Mrs. Grantham at dinner. Ruth sent north, destination unclear. The handwriting was shaky. Benjamin was terrified of being caught, but he wrote it down, and Elias felt something like relief. It wasn't much, but it was something. The information existed now. It had been recorded, but the entries were incomplete. They didn't say where the families actually ended up, only where they'd been taken initially. I thought it was lost in the war. Today I found it again preserved in the Nishio Historical Society. I am writing now to record the names I still remember. The people who were sold and who survived to see freedom. The people who died before freedom came. We are still here. We are still remembered. And then she began writing names. 23 names. People sold from Ridgefield in the 1850s who she knew had survived the war, who she'd encountered in Nishiotos or heard about through the network that still loosely existed. Names of people who died in the 1860s whose death she'd learned about after the war. Names of children born after emancipation to parents who'd been sold from Ridgefield decades earlier. She filled 2 pages with names. Then she set down the pen. "That's all I can write," she said. "The rest are gone. Lost. I don't know what happened to them." Vickers looked at the new entries. Then he looked at Iris. "Will you tell me about this?" he asked. "About how it was kept." "About why?" "Yes," Iris said. "I'll tell you everything." And she did. Iris spent the next 3 hours telling Thomas Vickers everything she knew about the diary. She told him about Elias, who'd started it in 1826 after watching 7 people sold from Ridgefield. She told him about Benjamin, who'd kept it for 23 years, who'd built the network of informants and carriers that made the diary possible. She told him about herself, about the years she'd spent continuing the work, about the decision to hide the diary with Daniel Hart to keep it safe during the war. She told him about the network, the free black people and occasional sympathetic whites who'd passed information across hundreds of miles, who'd risked their safety to track the movements of enslaved people through the domestic slave trade. She explained how they'd gathered information from bills of sale, from overheard conversations, from letters written in secret, from rumors passed along chains of communication that stretched from Texas to Mississippi to Alabama. Vickers took notes frantically. He understood that he was hearing something extraordinary. Not just the story of a diary, but the story of resistance, of memory, of people who'd refused to let their loved ones be erased. "Why did you do it?" Vickers asked. "Why take such risks?" Iris thought for a moment. Then she said, "Because they wanted us to forget." When someone was sold, it was like they never existed. Their name wasn't spoken. Their family wasn't acknowledged. They were just gone. But if we wrote it down, if we remembered, then they couldn't be erased. They existed. They mattered. That's why Vickers published a longer article about the diary in 1874, this time including information from his conversation with Iris. The article appeared in a regional historical journal and attracted some attention among historians and abolitionists in the North. A few people wrote to Vickers asking for more information, but for the most part the diary remained obscure. Iris died in 1891. She was 71 years old. She was buried in a cemetery in Nichito that served the black community. Her grave was marked with a simple wooden cross that rotted away within a decade. By the time the 20th century began, no one remembered where exactly she was buried. But her handwriting was in the diary. Her work was preserved. The diary remained in the Nichito's Historical Society's archives for more than a century. Occasionally, a historian would come across it while researching something else. Most spent little time with it. The handwriting was difficult, the entries cryptic, and it seemed like just another plantation record among thousands. Then in 1983, a graduate student named Evelyn Boudreau was researching family structures under slavery for her doctoral dissertation. She was at the Nishiotos Historical Society, going through unprocessed documents when she found the diary. She started reading and immediately realized she'd found something extraordinary. Evelyn spent the next 2 years with the diary. She transcribed every entry, a painstaking process because of the small handwriting and faded ink. She cross-referenced names with census records, plantation ledgers, bills of sale, death certificates, church records, anything she could find. She confirmed that the people named in the diary had existed. The sales had happened. The dates were accurate. The destinations matched bills of sale she found in other archives. The diary was genuine. It was a real record kept by enslaved people over nearly 40 years. Evelyn also tried to trace the network that had made the diary possible. She found references to Daniel Hart in land records and death certificates. She found mentions of Thomas Riley in steamboat manifests. She found a will from Reverend Cross that mentioned his work among enslaved people in Louisiana and Arkansas. Piece by piece, she confirmed that the network had existed, that it had functioned across state lines for decades. She published her findings in 1986 in the Journal of Southern History. The article titled The Ridgefield Diary, Enslaved People's Documentary Resistance in Antebellum, Louisiana, became one of the most cited works in slavery studies. It demonstrated that enslaved people hadn't been passive victims, but had actively resisted their erasure through documentation and memory keeping. The diary became known in academic circles as one of the most important primary sources on slavery's lived experience. It was referenced in dozens of books, hundreds of articles, countless dissertations. Scholars used it to understand family separation, the domestic slave trade, the networks of resistance that existed within slavery, the ways that enslaved people maintained their humanity despite systematic dehumanization. But the diary never became widely known outside academic circles. The Natchitoches Historical Society doesn't have the resources for major exhibitions. The diary is fragile, kept in a climate-controlled vault, rarely displayed. Most people who visit the Historical Society don't know it exists. In 2003, the Historical Society digitized the diary. High-resolution scans were made of every page. The digital version is available to researchers upon request, though few know to ask for it. Evelyn Boudreau, now a professor emerita at Tulane University, still studies the diary. In a 2015 interview, she said, "The Ridgefield Diary changes how we understand slavery. It proves that enslaved people weren't just enduring. They were documenting. They were bearing witness. They were ensuring that the people they loved wouldn't be forgotten. That's an act of profound resistance and profound love." The diary contains 173 names of people sold from Ridgefield between 1826 and 1858. It documents 64 confirmed deaths. It tracks people across 11 states. It includes entries about 3 generations of enslaved people, and it preserves the names of 3 people who kept it. Elias, who couldn't write, but knew someone needed to remember. Benjamin, who risked everything to continue the work for 23 years, and Iris, who carried it forward and ensured it survived. The diary's last entry, written by Iris in 1873, ends with a simple statement: "We are still here. We are still remembered." The Ridgefield Diary exists because 3 people refused to accept erasure. Elias, Benjamin, and Iris understood that memory is power, that documentation is resistance, that bearing witness is an act of defiance against a system designed to make people disappear. They didn't do it for recognition. They expected to be punished if discovered. They didn't keep this diary for posterity.